In the summer of 2014, in the vast Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho, a father and his two young children set out on a weekend camping trip. Their car was later found parked neatly by the trail, the tent still standing, belongings untouched. And yet, the family had vanished without a trace. Search teams, with dogs and helicopters, swept through every ridge, every stream. But for days, and then for years, not a single clue surfaced. The case slowly faded into silence, leaving only heartbreak for those who loved them. And yet, there was one photograph, taken at 6:47 p.m. on the 19th of July of that year, that still chills those who see it. In the picture, the father and his two children are smiling, happy, with the Sawtooth Mountains behind them. No one knew it then, but that would be the last time they were ever seen before vanishing forever into the wilderness. Michael Walker was a man many in his hometown admired. At 40 years old, he carried the weight of both triumph and tragedy on his shoulders. He had served in the military during his younger years, and after returning home, life had not been easy. His wife Sarah had battled a long illness, and Michael had stood by her side until the very end. Her passing left him a widower, raising two children on his own. Friends described him as quiet, thoughtful, and deeply protective of his family. Despite the hardships, Michael poured every ounce of his energy into giving his children the sense of normalcy they deserved. His children, Ethan and Grace, were his greatest joy. Ethan, 10 years old, carried a mix of his father's steady calm and a spark of curiosity that seemed endless. He loved the outdoors, climbing rocks, chasing insects, asking questions about the stars. Grace, just 7, was softer, more cautious, often clinging to her father's side, but quick to laugh at her brother's playful teasing. Together, the three of them had become inseparable, bound by a quiet resilience that only families who have known loss truly understand. By the summer of 2014, Michael had decided they needed a break from the routine of school, chores, and memories that lingered in their small home. He planned a weekend camping trip, nothing out of the ordinary, just a chance to breathe the mountain air, roast marshmallows by a fire, and let his children experience the wilderness he himself had come to love. The Sawtooth Mountains, with their jagged peaks and sparkling lakes, were the perfect escape. On the morning they left, neighbors saw them loading the car. The children were excited, piling sleeping bags and backpacks into the trunk. Grace clutched a stuffed rabbit she insisted on bringing along, while Ethan carried a flashlight he had begged his father to let him use on the trip. Michael, as always, moved with calm efficiency, securing the gear and checking over the vehicle before they set out. To those who watched them drive away, it looked like nothing more than a family heading off to make a new memory together. Later that evening, at precisely 6:47 p.m., a hiker captured a photograph on a ridge overlooking the valley. In it, Michael stood tall, with an arm around each of his children. Ethan grinned proudly, his baseball cap tilted sideways, while Grace leaned against her father, smiling shyly. Behind them, the jagged outline of the Sawtooth Mountains glowed under the fading light of the Sunday. It was a moment of peace, a portrait of happiness frozen in time. No one knew then that this image would become haunting. For in the days that followed, no one would see Michael, Ethan, or Grace ever again. When Michael and his children did not return home by Sunday evening, it was his sister, Linda, who first grew concerned. She had expected a call, at least a message letting her know they were safe. Instead, her phone stayed silent. By Monday morning, worry had turned to fear. Michael was a responsible father. He never ignored check-ins, especially when it came to his children. Linda contacted local authorities, reporting that the family had failed to return from their weekend camping trip. Deputies from the Custer County Sheriff's Office were dispatched to the Sawtooth area. The first clue came quickly. Michael's SUV, parked neatly near a trailhead. There was no sign of forced entry, no mechanical trouble. Inside were a few extra supplies, snacks, water, a first aid kit left untouched. It was as though the vehicle had been deliberately locked and abandoned. Not far from the car, officers discovered the campsite. A small green tent had been pitched near a clearing, with sleeping bags unrolled inside. A cooler still held fresh food and drinks. On a nearby log, marshmallow skewers had been laid out, ready for use. The scene looked frozen in time, as if its occupants had simply stepped away for a moment and never come back. Searchers called out their names, their voices echoing across the trees. They checked the nearby creek, scanned the rocky ridges, and followed the faint trails that wound deeper into the forest. But there were no footprints, no broken branches, no discarded belongings, nothing to indicate where Michael, Ethan, and Grace had gone. As word spread, volunteers arrived to help. By the second day, search teams with dogs swept the area, and helicopters circled overhead. The terrain was rugged, dense with pine and granite, and searchers knew that if the family had strayed too far, they might have been injured or trapped. Still, the hope was that Michael, with his military training and calm nature, would have been able to protect his children until help arrived. But as the hours stretched into days, hope began to thin. Each new sweep of the forest ended the same way, empty-handed. The tent still stood in its clearing, growing lonelier with each passing night. The car remained by the trailhead, a silent reminder of a journey that had started so ordinarily and had spiraled into a mystery no one could explain. To the investigators, the first hours after the disappearance made no sense. Families who wandered off in the woods usually left a trace, a trail, a dropped item, even a faint footprint in the dirt. But here, it was as though Michael and his children had stepped into the forest and simply dissolved into the air. What had happened in that brief window of time between the last cheerful photograph and the empty silence of the camp? That question would haunt the search for years to come. The Custer County Sheriff's Office quickly escalated the case. By the third day, what had started as a local search had grown into a full-scale operation. The Idaho Search and Rescue Association deployed additional teams, while federal agencies offered resources, including aerial surveillance. The Sawtooth Mountains, vast and unforgiving, became the center of one of the largest search efforts the region had seen in years. Helicopters swept across valleys and ridgelines, their infrared cameras scanning for body heat. On the ground, teams of volunteers, deputies, and forest rangers fanned out in grids, calling the families' names into the wilderness. Search dogs sniffed tirelessly along creeks and ravines, but no fresh scent could be picked up. At night, rescuers set up base camps with floodlights, hoping that if Michael and his children were still alive, they would be drawn toward the glow. But night after night passed, and no one came. Detectives began piecing together what little information they had. The SUV's odometer suggested no unusual detours. The campsite showed no struggle, no signs of wild animals, no footprints from intruders, no overturned gear. Even the food left behind was intact, untouched by scavengers in those first few days, as if nature itself hesitated to disturb the scene. Witness interviews brought little clarity. A hiker remembered seeing a man and two children earlier that weekend near a ridge, matching Michael's description. They appeared happy, even cheerful, as though enjoying their trip without concern. Another camper recalled hearing children's laughter echoing through the pines late on Saturday evening, but could not be sure of the direction. Beyond those faint glimpses, the trail went cold. Speculation began to fill the gaps where evidence was missing. Some believed the family had wandered too far from camp and become trapped in the rugged terrain, perhaps a fall into one of the deep ravines, or an accident by the fast-flowing river. Others whispered darker theories, that someone had lured them away, or that foul play had been involved. Investigators, however, struggled with one undeniable fact. There was no sign of violence, no indication that another person had been there at all. Michael's military background drew attention as well. Some wondered if he had intentionally vanished, choosing to retreat from society, but those closest to him dismissed the idea immediately. Michael had built his life around his children after losing his wife. Abandoning them or leading them into danger was unthinkable. His sister Linda spoke firmly to reporters. Michael would never walk away, not from Ethan, not from Grace. As weeks passed, frustration deepened. Teams had covered more than 100 square miles of rugged forest, charting every possible trail, cave, and stream. Drones were deployed in hopes of spotting something missed from the ground. Still, the forest gave nothing back. The media seized on the story, labeling it the Sawtooth Mystery. News crews camped outside the sheriff's office, interviewing tearful relatives and weary searchers. The public followed every update, captivated by the haunting question: how could 3 people vanish so completely in a land so often traveled by hikers and hunters? Eventually, the massive search began to wind down. Resources dwindled, and after nearly a month with no discoveries, officials were forced to scale back. The Walker campsite was finally dismantled, the tent packed away as evidence, the SUV towed from the trailhead. What remained was silence, a void where laughter and life had once been. For Linda and the rest of the family, the unanswered questions were unbearable. They clung to the hope that Michael, Ethan, and Grace were still out there, perhaps lost but alive, waiting to be found. Yet deep inside, a colder thought lingered. The Sawtooth Mountains had swallowed them whole, and no one could say why. The investigation had reached its limits, but the mystery was only beginning to grow. For the next 6 years, the Sawtooth Mountains stood as both monument and mystery. The official search ended, but the questions lingered, gnawing at the hearts of those who had loved Michael, Ethan, and Grace. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, small groups gathered at the trailhead where the SUV had once been found. Some brought flowers, others left notes, each gesture a fragile attempt to bridge the silence that had stretched on for so long. Linda attended faithfully, her voice breaking each time she spoke about her brother and the children. "We just need answers," she would say to reporters. "Not knowing is worse than anything." The case remained open but inactive, a cold file in the sheriff's office. Detectives rotated in and out, occasionally revisiting the evidence, but no new leads surfaced. The photograph taken at 6:47 p.m. on that last evening became iconic, reprinted in newspapers and online articles whenever the story resurfaced. To many, it was haunting. 3 smiling faces, unaware that it was the final record of their existence. Theories multiplied over time. Some locals believed the family had fallen victim to the wilderness itself, perhaps lost in a remote canyon, or swept away by an unmarked stream. Others leaned toward darker possibilities, an encounter with a stranger or a crime carefully concealed. Internet forums dissected every detail, with amateur sleuths poring over maps and satellite images, convinced that clues were hidden in plain sight. But the mountains offered no answers. The dense forests grew thicker, storms reshaped the terrain, and whatever evidence had once been there was slowly swallowed by time. Hikers passed through the same valleys and ridges where search teams had scoured years before, unaware that a family's fate was etched into the silence of those woods. For the Walkers' relatives, the passage of time was cruel. Children who had once played with Ethan and Grace grew older, graduated, and started new lives, while their friends remained forever frozen in memory at ages 10 and 7. Michael's absence left a wound that refused to heal, a reminder that even the strongest fathers could vanish, leaving only questions behind. By the 6th year, the story was rarely mentioned in the news. The world had moved on, but the Sawtooth Mountains had not forgotten. Deep in the wilderness, hidden beyond where most dared to venture, the truth waited quietly until the day a hunter's dog stumbled upon something that would change everything. It was early autumn of 2020 when a hunter named Richard Collins set out into the Sawtooth wilderness. Richard had hunted these mountains since his youth, and he knew the land well. The winding creeks, the steep ridges, the valleys where elk often moved at dusk. He was not searching for answers to an old mystery. He was simply looking for game. At his side trotted Duke, his loyal hunting dog, a seasoned bloodhound with a keen nose and restless energy. The morning began uneventfully. The forest was quiet, painted in shades of gold and rust as the season turned. Richard moved deeper than usual, following signs of elk farther into a stretch of wilderness few hikers bothered to reach. The terrain was rough, littered with boulders and dense undergrowth. Duke sniffed the ground, darting ahead and circling back, always alert. By mid-afternoon, as the light softened through the trees, Duke suddenly froze. His body stiffened, ears pricked, and then he began barking with an urgency Richard had rarely seen. The dog charged toward a rocky outcrop, his nose to the ground, barking louder and louder. Richard followed, calling out, but Duke ignored him, intent on something hidden among the rocks. When Richard reached the spot, he saw Duke pawing frantically at a narrow crevice between two boulders. At first, Richard assumed the dog had caught the scent of an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a squirrel hiding inside. But then he noticed something unusual. Amid the dirt and leaves was a fragment of fabric, weathered but still recognizable as part of a backpack strap. Richard crouched down, pulling aside brush and loose stones. What he saw made his stomach tighten. Inside the crevice, partially concealed by years of fallen branches and soil, lay the unmistakable shape of human remains. Shaken, he called Duke back and steadied himself. He knew instantly what this might mean. For 6 years, the story of the Walker family had haunted the region. Could this be them? Richard marked the location and hiked back out of the wilderness as quickly as he could, contacting the sheriff's office as soon as he had cell service. Within hours, deputies and investigators were on their way to the site. Richard led them back the next morning, Duke bounding ahead once more to the place he had uncovered. The scene was grim. In the crevice, searchers found more than bones. There were scraps of clothing, faded by sun and rain, a small child's shoe, its laces frayed, a rusted flashlight, long drained of power, and tucked among the debris was a stuffed rabbit, its fabric torn, but still instantly recognizable. Linda would later confirm it had belonged to Grace, her constant companion on every trip. Investigators carefully recovered the remains, noting that they were not scattered but clustered closely together. Forensic experts would later confirm that the bones belonged to Michael Walker and his 2 children, Ethan and Grace. The discovery, long overdue, was both heartbreaking and relieving. After years of silence, the family had finally been found. Yet the answers raised new questions. How had they ended up in such an inaccessible location, miles away from their campsite? Why had search teams never uncovered the crevice, even after scouring the region so thoroughly? And perhaps most haunting of all, what had happened in those final hours before their lives ended? News of the discovery spread quickly, reopening wounds in the community. For Linda, the phone call from investigators was surreal. She had waited 6 long years, torn between hope and despair. Now she had something solid, something final but no true explanation. "At least we can bring them home," she said quietly to a reporter. "At least we know." Duke, the dog who had stumbled upon the remains, became an unlikely hero in the story. Many saw it as fate, that after years of fruitless searching, it was not helicopters or teams of experts that solved the mystery, but a hunting dog following his instincts through the woods. Still, as investigators packed up the evidence and carried the remains out of the forest, one truth hung heavy in the air. The Walker family had finally been found. But the forest still held back the one thing everyone wanted most: the story of how and why they had vanished. In the weeks following the discovery, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together what little evidence the mountains had preserved. Forensic teams analyzed the skeletal remains, clothing, and personal items recovered from the crevice. Dental records and DNA confirmed without doubt the bones belonged to Michael Walker and his 2 children, Ethan and Grace. For the first time in 6 years, their fates were no longer a question. Yet the remains told only fragments of the story. Experts determined that the family had likely perished not long after they disappeared in 2014. The bones showed no clear signs of violent trauma, no bullet holes, no knife marks, no evidence of a struggle with another person. Instead, the position of the bodies suggested they had been huddled close together in their final moments, perhaps seeking warmth or comfort. Nearby items offered further clues. The rusted flashlight had been switched to the on position, as if used during a desperate night in the wilderness. A child-sized jacket was found folded neatly, as though Michael had tried to shield his daughter from the cold. The stuffed rabbit, though weathered, remained near Grace's remains, a heartbreaking reminder of her innocence. Investigators speculated that the family may have become lost after leaving their campsite. The crevice where they were found lay in a remote, rocky section of the Sawtooth Range, miles from the established trails. Perhaps Michael had led his children in search of a landmark, or water, or safety, but the terrain was unforgiving, and with each mile, the forest grew darker and more treacherous. The official report leaned toward a tragic accident. The walkers, it concluded, had succumbed to the elements' exhaustion, exposure, and the merciless conditions of the wilderness. Still, certain details troubled detectives. How could experienced search teams, equipped with dogs and helicopters, have missed the site so completely back in 2014? The crevice, though narrow, was not invisible. Some wondered if it had been concealed at the time by fallen trees or shifting rock, only to be uncovered years later. For the family, the answers were bittersweet. The long wait for closure was over, but the truth was incomplete. Linda, holding the small stuffed rabbit that had once belonged to Grace, put it simply, "We finally know where they are, but we may never know why." The official investigation closed with the label "Death by Misadventure." Yet the questions left behind continued to echo, as haunting as the silence of the mountains themselves. Though the sheriff's report marked the Walker case as death by misadventure, not everyone was convinced. The details were too strange, the gaps in the timeline too wide, and the haunting symbolism of the discovery too unsettling for many to accept at face value. One of the most persistent theories was that Michael and his children had been stalked. Some locals whispered about a reclusive hermit said to live deep within the Sawtooths, a man who avoided all contact with the outside world. While no evidence ever proved his existence, hikers occasionally reported eerie signs, makeshift shelters, traps strung across game trails, and the feeling of being watched. Could the walkers have crossed paths with someone who wanted them gone? Others suggested the family had fallen victim to something even darker. Online forums buzzed with speculation about cult activity in remote Idaho. Several users claimed the mountains were dotted with hidden meeting places, and that the walkers' disappearance bore the hallmarks of a ritual or abduction. Investigators dismissed these theories as baseless, but they lingered in the public imagination. Then there were the wilderness purists, who believed nature itself had been the culprit. The Sawtooths are notorious for sudden weather shifts. A storm could have swept in, disorienting Michael and his children, forcing them into unfamiliar territory. Some theorists even wondered if they had been attacked by a wild animal, though no bite or claw marks were found on the bones. The most haunting theory of all came from those who had searched the mountains themselves. Many search and rescue veterans swore they had combed the very ridge where the walkers were found. How could 3 bodies, a backpack, and personal items remain hidden for 6 years? Unless, as some grimly suggested, they had not been there the whole time. Perhaps they had been moved. That thought, more than anything else, sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to imagine it. If true, it would mean someone had known exactly where the walkers were all along and had chosen to keep that secret until fate and a hunter's dog finally revealed it. The walker's story remains carved into the silence of the Sawtooth Mountains, a chilling reminder of how quickly an ordinary family trip can unravel into a nightmare beyond comprehension. Though the remains were found and the investigation closed, the truth lies buried deeper than the crevice where they spent their final moments. To this day, hikers passing through those ridges pause, uneasy, when the wind whistles through the pines. Some leave flowers or notes near the trailhead, small tokens for strangers they never met, but whose story echoes across every shadow of the forest. Others refuse to tread those paths altogether, convinced that the mountains hold on tightly to the souls of those they claim. The discovery brought closure, yes, but also a darker weight. If 3 lives could vanish so completely, only to be uncovered years later by chance, what else remains, hidden in the wilderness? How many mysteries lie just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Michael, Ethan, and Grace are gone, yet their absence lingers, not only in the grief of their family, but in the unanswered questions that haunt the Sawtooths. The stuffed rabbit, the folded jacket, the flashlight left switched on each item is a whisper of love and despair, frozen in time. The Walker case is over on paper, but in the human heart and in the dark corners of the mountains, the mystery endures.